This is Newsdrive with Mhairi Stuart. Now, a UK-wide public inquiry into the NHS-infected blood scandal has begun to hear witness statements. Thousands of people with haemophilia were infected with HIV or hepatitis C in the 1970s and 80s through contaminated blood products. More than 2,000 are thought to have died. Des Collins is a senior partner at Collins Solicitors, who's representing more than 1,000 victims and their families. He's hopeful that the truth will be revealed by this inquiry.
It's a moment they've waited for 40 years. It's tinged with expectation and, of course, deep sadness for the people who've died in the last 40 years. They cannot put that behind them completely.
Well, Dan Farthing-Sykes is the CEO of Haemophilia Scotland, and he's been attending the hearings in London today.
The disappointment with the Penrose inquiry in Scotland was that it didn't really achieve much in itself. It made one recommendation to do a look back and look for other victims. And obviously that's something the inquiry today was stressing, that if anybody thinks that they may have had a blood transfusion and haven't had a hepatitis C test, then they're urging people to go and look for that. That could save lives if the inquiry raises awareness.
So for Scottish people then who are going to be taking part in this inquiry, you mentioned the Penrose inquiry, which we've already had. It's interesting we have another inquiry, but many people did criticise the Penrose inquiry for being a bit of a whitewash.
That's right. So the new inquiry has broader terms of reference and is looking at all the infections that might have come from contaminated blood and blood products, and not just HIV and hepatitis. So we're expecting, from a Scottish point of view, some emphasis on variant CJD, because a whole new cohort of people have been exposed potentially to variant CJD through blood and blood products, and that wasn't looked at all. Another thing that wasn't looked at Penrose that will be looked at through this inquiry is the financial support that's provided. That wasn't part of the remit, and Lord Penrose therefore didn't make any comment on it. The Scottish Government did make improvements, but the whole system of financial support and other sorts of support are going to be specifically looked at. And the third really important thing that's new about this inquiry is it's looking at the accusations that there's been a cover-up. For years people have said documents have been destroyed, attempts to have this issue looked at have been thwarted, and the very fact that that's been their experience is within the terms of reference of the new inquiry. So there are three big themes which we're hoping will be looked at through this inquiry that weren't looked at by the Penrose inquiry.
Yeah, that's one thing that people that will be giving evidence to this inquiry keep saying, is there's a big element here of culpability. They want to see somebody, if somebody has done something wrong, held to account. Yes,
and for a lot of people, it's not just the accountability, it's that we learn from this disaster. Thousands of people have died. Lots of people are living in lives with ongoing poor health, or where their financial circumstances are nothing like what they would have been. And they want to make sure that there are no more victims in the future, that the lessons that could have been learned from this experience are learnt and everybody benefits. So not just in blood safety, but there's likely to be things about how people are informed of risk, how emerging therapies are treated to make sure that people understand what they're going into. There's lots of elements of this which we think, once you really get under the skin of this disaster, might create lessons that could benefit everybody.
Yeah, it is going to be very difficult for people to give evidence, isn't it? Because some of it really is quite harrowing.
Yes, this morning was a good example of that. The first affected person to give evidence had an incredibly difficult story of his infection and his brother's infection, and the impact it's had on his life and his family, both his parents and his own family. And the atmosphere in the room was just, it was impossible to bear, really. It was so emotional. So many people in the room recognising their own stories in what was being said from the witness chair. And that's going to be the experience for weeks and weeks as we go through these hearings, hearing the experiences of people whose lives have been devastated by these infections. After the various investigations that have been, presumably it's really important that this one does deliver what people, the victims, are wanting. Absolutely. I mean, really, we've got to see an end to people having to fight for their roof over their head. We've got to end the situation where people just don't know what happened to their family and have all these questions that need answering. This really has to be the time that those questions are answered and people can move on with what remains of their lives and enjoy their families and not have to feel they have to campaign day after day to have basic questions answered. And not just how they were infected, but the delay there was in telling people they might have been. That's right. We were hearing this morning that people weren't informed that they were going to be tested at all. Inappropriate ways have been informed of the results or not been informed of the results for many years. And I'm sure that's going to come out again and again. We know that from our work in Scotland, that's a almost universal experience within the Scottish families affected, that people were not told for years. And that does a lot of damage to trust. Obviously, there's missed opportunities to change your lifestyle. If you've got hepatitis but don't know, you could stop drinking. People worry about whether they've exposed their friends and families to risk because they had an infection and didn't know about it. And they look back every time they had a nosebleed or a cut, and did they treat the blood appropriately? What if a child or a wife or partner had become exposed as a result of them not knowing? And those sorts of things can really eat away at people over the years.
Dan Farthing-Sykes there from Haemophilia Scotland. The time now is 6:10. A public inquiry into how thousands of people contracted HIV and hepatitis C from contaminated blood products has begun hearing from people affected. Its chairman, Sir Brian Langstaff, said some of the evidence would prompt tears, while some would provoke indignation. Sophie Hutchinson reports from the inquiry in central London.
This was an historic day for those infected by the contaminated blood and for their loved ones. Some had waited more than 30 years for this chance to put their suffering on record. Sir Brian Langstaff, who's leading the inquiry, described the evidence he'd read as incredibly moving and sometimes chillingly factual, and he paid tribute to the witnesses.
For many, making a statement has been, and for some it yet will be, an act of bravery. And I'd like to acknowledge that publicly here and now. It may have stirred up, and it may yet stir up, distressing memories.
First to give evidence was Derek Martindale, who had severe haemophilia. Sitting next to his son for moral support, he spoke, sometimes with his voice breaking, of the trauma he'd suffered. Like so many thousands, he had been treated with infected blood products. He described the moment when, aged 23, his doctor gave him the life-changing news.
I was told that I was HIV positive. I was told I had about a year to live. I was told not to tell anybody, including my family and my parents.
That was because of the stigma of HIV in the 1980s. It's estimated that 5,000 people with bleeding disorders and as many as 30,000 others who needed blood transfusions were infected with HIV and hepatitis in the 1970s and 80s. The blood they were treated with had been bought from abroad, some from American prisoners, many of whom had the infections. Carol Ann Hill was the second witness to speak. She explained how she was infected with hepatitis C after a blood transfusion, but was not told until 30 years later.
The fact that the thousands of people out there who, like me, didn't have the least idea that they got hepatitis C, and there may be a whole wave of more work coming from that, and I hope it's going to be handled the darn sight better than it has been up to now.
Victims and their relatives are hoping to find out why warnings about the safety of the blood products may have been ignored and why many documents and patient records appear to have been lost or destroyed. Between now and October, the inquiry will spend 11 weeks travelling around England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, gathering accounts from those who have suffered in this treatment disaster.
Sophie Hutchinson reporting.